Welcome to the Tim Booker channel, where wisdom deserves to be shared. Wishing you a pleasant listening experience. In this episode, we will delve into Wild Thought. The author, Claude Lévi-Strauss, is a renowned French philosopher and anthropologist. Published over 50 years ago, this book is a classic in the field of anthropology. It puts forth a bold perspective, that primitive civilizations are not necessarily the precursors of modern civilizations, instead, the two are equal in status. This perspective challenges our conventional wisdom. You might wonder how primitive civilizations, seemingly less advanced, could be considered equal to modern ones. Early anthropologists shared a similar view, often depicting primitive people as uncivilized, even barbaric, with strange customs and the worship of animals as their ancestors. These practices appeared foolish and laughable to modern sensibilities. During that time, Western societies, influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, believed that human society evolved from a savage stage to civilization. Non-Western societies were considered primitive, with only the West representing modern civilization. This view served to justify Western colonial expansion. Claude questioned this mainstream belief: are primitive civilizations truly less advanced than modern ones? Is totem worship as simple as it seems? Are primitive people truly lacking in intelligence and scientific thinking? Perhaps many of our impressions of primitive people stem from a lack of understanding, leading to arrogance and bias. To truly understand primitive people, Claude immersed himself in South America, living with local tribes for many years. He closely studied their social systems and customs, ultimately arriving at his conclusion: although primitive civilizations may appear uncivilized, they possess the same underlying thought structures as modern civilizations. In this sense, the two are equal. Now, let's explore how the author supports this view from three different angles. First, primitive people's thinking is not backward, it's merely different from ours. It is a specific form of science with a logic that aligns with modern thought. Second, we examine two crucial systems in primitive societies: totemism and naming systems. Although the specific details may seem irrational, their structures are logical. Building on this, we further argue that primitive and modern civilizations share deep structural similarities, making them equal. To begin our exploration, let's focus on how primitive people's thinking differs from that of modern people. The author observed that primitive people possess a unique ability to classify animals and plants, discerning subtle differences among them. Some of these distinctions might seem insignificant to modern individuals. For instance, the Hanuno'o people of the Philippines can identify 75 bird species, several snake species, and name each one. While the author acknowledges that primitive classification often relies on sensory observation, which may not be as practically useful as modern biological classifications, he quickly points out that primitive people classify out of curiosity. For instance, the Native Americans of the Northeast do not consume snake meat, yet they show keen interest in classifying snakes. You might wonder how primitive people's classification differs fundamentally from our familiar biological classifications. Let me provide an example. When primitive people encounter an unknown animal, they identify its most prominent feature and use that feature to name the animal. As they remember more animals with different features, they develop their own classification system. Using this method, the Hanuno'o people of the Philippines identified 75 bird species and several snake species. So how does modern biological science approach classification? Modern science doesn't emphasize the external features of animals. We know that some animals may look similar but belong to different species, like whales and sharks. Whales are mammals, while sharks are fish. Modern biological classification relies on a systematic framework of class, order, family, genus, species. This framework provides a concept of the animal's place in the hierarchy. Any future specific animal will always fit within this framework. To summarize, primitive people and modern people do think differently. Primitive people summarize structures from events, whereas modern people first establish structures and then deduce events. However, upon closer inspection, these two modes of thinking essentially reverse the positions of events and structures within the same underlying logic. In reality, humans have never truly abandoned primitive thinking. We often use the primitive mode of thinking in our daily lives, alongside the modern scientific approach. Let's consider an example related to art. Professional art schools train students using the scientific approach. Students first learn a set of aesthetic styles and then use these styles to find inspiration for their work. However, there are also exceptionally gifted artists who employ the primitive mode of thinking. They are moved by the beauty of a specific object and then seek a structure that immortalizes that beauty. In art history, the relationship between events and structures is in constant flux, influenced by aesthetic trends and societal contexts. The only constant is that art is always a combination of events and structures. When the contingency of events is integrated into the necessity of structures, aesthetic emotions emerge. In conclusion, the author argues that primitive people's observations of nature are also a form of scientific thinking. It's just a specific form of science that moves from events to structures, as opposed to the modern mode of thinking that starts with structures and then deduces events. Primitive thinking, while limited in accommodating new events, is not inherently inferior. Both modes of thinking are equal, and in addressing problems, modern individuals draw from both. Primitive people's thinking shapes their cultural systems and societal structures. Continuing with the second part, let's explore the author's analysis of primitive societal systems. We'll focus on two crucial systems, totemism and naming systems. The author points out that the underlying logic of these systems connects humanity with nature and the individual with the collective, contributing to the stability of society. Let's begin with the totemic system. Modern people often view primitive cultures as ignorant, primarily because they worship animals as their ancestors. But is the totemic system entirely devoid of reason? Is there a deeper rationale behind the rituals that primitive people perform in the name of animal totems? On the surface, the totemic system of primitive cultures may seem illogical, driven by the boundless creativity of these cultures. For instance, the Osage people in northern Australia use the eagle as their totem because the eagle reminds them of lightning, which, in turn, reminds them of fire, and fire reminds them of coal buried beneath the earth. Therefore, the eagle becomes the totem of the earth. Similarly, the Arent people in central Western Australia consider the squirrel as their totem for warfare because the squirrel's body resembles the human form, and pine cones represent human heads. The action of the squirrel in removing pine cones is likened to beheading enemies, thus making the squirrel the totem for warfare. From a modern perspective, the totemic systems of primitive people may appear illogical because the content of totems seems arbitrary. However, the author argues that the randomness of totem content cannot obscure the necessity of the totemic structure. When we abstract from specific totemic animals and solely examine the structure of totemism, we find that totemism essentially forms a connection between nature, animals, and human society. On one hand, primitive people have transitioned from a natural state to a civilized society. On the other hand, they still heavily depend on the gifts of nature, seeking strength from the natural world. The totemic system is a product of this contradictory state, turning animals into totems. On one side, it integrates animals from the natural world into human civilization, giving these animals a humanized significance. For instance, as mentioned earlier, connecting squirrels with human warfare. But on the other side, primitive tribes, by treating totem animals as their ancestors or siblings, anthropomorphize humans, naturalizing their society. For example, the Hibaro people in the southeastern United States supposedly have tribes such as the Phantasma bears, who rely on fishing and wild fruits, the Puma people, who rely on hunting, the Wildcat people, who sleep during the day and hunt at night, and the Bird people, who rise before dawn. These descriptions might be somewhat exaggerated, and the actual situation probably involves different tribal divisions of labor. However, what's thought-provoking is that this social division of labor, evolving from human civilization, is perceived by primitive people as the projection of natural order into human society. Different tribes engage in different tasks because, in nature, the animals representing these tribes were inherently performing similar roles. Through this examination, it becomes evident that the totemic system transforms animals into a link between humanity and nature, civilization and wilderness. While the content of totems is random and subject to change with tribe migration, population fluctuation, and environmental shifts, the structure of totemism possesses necessity and stability. If we consider that the totemic system establishes connections between humans and animals, society and nature, then primitive naming systems establish connections between the individual and the collective. For primitive societies, the birth of a child is a random event that disrupts the existing social structure. Consequently, the structure must be adjusted to incorporate this new event. In response, the Wageman people living in the southern region of Australia devised a solution. They gave each newborn child 3 names, a big name, a small name, and a secret name. The big name relates to the head or upper body of the collective totem, the small name relates to the tail or lower body of the collective totem, and the secret name is entirely random. When a child is born, an elder pulls a flag while randomly reciting all these names. The name spoken at the moment the placenta is discarded becomes the child's secret name. So, the big name and small name derive from the collective totem, signifying the necessity of the structure. In contrast, the secret name is an individual's name, pointing to the contingency of the event. Through this naming system, events and structures, individuals and collectives are interconnected. There are 2 more intriguing examples from primitive societies, the Pinan people, residing in the tropical rainforests of Indonesia, and the Algonquin people in North America, including the United States and Canada. In the Pinan society, only children and the deceased possess individual names. Others are referred to by the names of their children or the wives of deceased relatives. The Pinan people believe that having a personal name is not desirable. It implies either youth or death, disqualifying one from the social collective structure. The brilliance of this naming system is that, for primitive societies, both birth and death are uncontrollable chance events, with personal names pointing to exclusive individuality. However, with birth and death, another individual can enter the structure, shedding their exclusive name to gain a name connected to the social collective. In contrast, the Algonquin people follow a different naming system. When a child is born, they have no name until a senior relative dies, at which point the child inherits that relative's totem name. In this naming system, with birth and death, one person loses their totem name, detaching from the structure, while another person gains a totem name, entering the structure. The author concludes that in primitive societies, many customs and systems, which may appear to have opposing content, share similar structures and often convey the same meaning. Totem systems and naming systems both aim to incorporate random events into necessary structures. The content of totems and names may be random and ever-changing, but the structure is not foolish. It reflects the underlying logic of primitive people connecting humanity with nature, the individual with the collective. After examining the arguments presented in the previous 2 sections, the author has demonstrated that primitive thought and modern thought are fundamentally similar. The societal systems of primitive societies have a logical foundation, but you may still find it hard to accept that primitive civilizations are equal to our modern civilization. This is because there's a deeply ingrained notion in our minds that human civilization is an ongoing, ever-evolving process. So, early primitive civilizations must surely be less advanced than modern ones. In the 3rd part, Claude presents a rather unconventional viewpoint. He argues that history is essentially a subjective illusion of humans. Based on this, he posits that modern and primitive civilizations are not superior or inferior to each other, they are simply 2 distinct forms of civilization. You might think this is going too far. After all, we have an abundance of written and visual records that prove the existence of history. Is the author suggesting we should regard all this objective evidence as mere subjective illusions? Of course not. The author doesn't deny the existence of objective evidence, he fully believes that many events did occur in the past. However, past events don't automatically translate into history. If history is defined solely as events that happened in the past, it leads to a fundamental question: what events are part of history? Even in a single day in the past, every person experienced countless events. History cannot encompass every past event but is instead a selective assembly of these events into a meaningful and understandable narrative. In other words, the significance of history, for us humans, doesn't lie in what events happened in the past but in how these events are arranged and structured. Although past events are objectively real, the selection and organization of these events depend on human subjective thinking. People with different views of history will choose different events, or even if they choose the same events, they might organize them differently, leading to entirely different narratives of history. History is, therefore, a product of human subjective thinking. Mainstream historical perspectives portray human civilization as an evolving process, heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. Under this influence, we tend to believe that primitive civilizations are less advanced, and modern civilizations have developed after them. However, according to the author, this perspective is just one of many. He proposes a different understanding, suggesting that primitive and modern civilizations are equal. The evidence for this is that although the specific content of primitive civilizations differs from modern ones, at a deeper structural level, they share many similarities. For instance, modern people often ridicule primitive societies for their totem worship, believing that attributing animals as ancestors is a foolish and laughable practice. But modern individuals engage in remarkably similar practices without realizing it. Take, for instance, the concept of Han Chinese. In reality, several major waves of ethnic integration have rendered the idea of a pure Han Chinese bloodline obsolete. But the concept of Han Chinese continues to hold us together. When Chinese people refer to themselves as descendants of Yan and Huang, it bonds individuals with a collective and empowers them. Similarly, an American observing the American flag rising on the Olympic podium experiences a sense of pride that links the individual with a collective. In a profound structural sense, primitive people's totem worship and our modern notions of ethnicity and nationality are quite similar. They all use symbols to connect individuals with an imagined collective, granting them strength. This symbol could be an animal totem, the concept of Han Chinese, or the pattern of the national flag. If we delve deeper into various institutions within modern civilization, we'll be surprised to find that many of our behaviors resemble those of primitive people. For example, modern people toil daily, primarily to earn money. Yet, from a primitive perspective, these so-called money notes are just pieces of paper. Why do modern people invest so much effort to earn a few pieces of paper? Perhaps, from the viewpoint of primitive people, modern individuals might appear more foolish. Money itself holds no intrinsic power. It's only when an entire modern society acknowledges the symbolic power that this piece of paper represents that it becomes a totem for modern individuals. Alright, we've concluded the third part. The author presents a highly unconventional viewpoint in this book. History is a product of human subjective thinking. The belief that human civilization is progressive is just one perspective within history. If we step back and look at it, at a deep structural level, primitive and modern civilizations are remarkably similar. So, we can also say that in terms of status, primitive and modern civilizations are equal. Alright, we've now covered the ambitious thinking. Next, let's recap the content we've discussed so far. The first part primarily discussed the concrete science possessed by primitive people. It functions like a craftsman, constantly deducing structure from specific events. Modern scientific thinking, on the other hand, starts by defining a structure and then fitting events into that structure. Then, we talked about primitive societies' totem and naming systems. Despite appearing illogical or foolish on the surface, they are reasonable at a deep structural level. Moreover, the systems in our modern civilization are fundamentally similar to those of primitive people in this deep structure. Hence, primitive and modern civilizations are essentially equal. Finally, we need to emphasize one more point regarding this book. This book is undoubtedly essential, and the author's logical arguments are highly rigorous. It dismantles a long-standing bias in anthropology that has portrayed Western civilization as advanced and primitive civilizations as barbaric and ignorant. The author has identified structures within primitive civilizations that resemble Western civilization, demonstrating that primitive civilizations are not inherently inferior. However, could it be possible that the author has overinterpreted things? After all, Claude Lévi-Strauss's analysis of primitive civilizations is also subjective, as he selectively incorporated information into his own structure. Nevertheless, this doesn't detract from the book's crucial contribution to our understanding. Today, humanity's view of progress in history and differences in civilization has become more diverse and nuanced. This book can be considered a trailblazer in this regard. In the highly globalized world we live in today, diverse perspectives and values are more valuable than ever. Civilizations do not necessarily need to compete in a survival of the fittest manner. To coexist peacefully on Earth, we must learn to respect one another, rather than considering our own civilization superior to others. That concludes all the content for this episode. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel. Like and share with your family and friends. Wisdom is worth spreading, paving the way for a better future. Thank you, and goodbye.